Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're so pleased to have Jennifer McClellan with us today from the Virginia State Senate. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So what are you hearing from your constituents about this 2018 session?
Well, I think a lot of people are hopeful that with both the House and the Senate being close and Democratic governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, that we'll be able to make progress on some issues we haven't before, such as Medicaid expansion. I'm hearing a lot from the schools, parents, teachers, students about making sure we fully fund our public education needs. I think those are the main things I'm hearing. People concerned about gun safety, and people concerned about changes in Washington under President Trump, and what Congress may or may not do and what impact that'll have on the state.
So it has a huge impact on the state in terms of its budget, because the state of Virginia is still highly dependent on the federal government for money.
Yes, I'm not sure if we're still the #1 recipient, but if not #1, we're #2. And particularly in Northern Virginia, we have a large federal contracting industry that relies on contracts from the federal government. We have a lot of federal government employees. And everything from our Title I schools to the CHIP program, is touched by the federal budget. So, but there's also a lot of concern about the president's attempts to roll back pretty much everything that President Obama did, and the trickle-down effect that would have here in Virginia.
I guess the latest example of that is the mandate that individuals get health insurance. That's gone now.
Yeah, and that was sort of a linchpin of the Affordable Care Act. So, we're still trying to figure out how to cover the over about 300,000 Virginians who don't have health insurance now, and hope that is not going to make it worse.
Now, you mentioned the CHIP program, because as a result of the agreement that was just reached yesterday, I believe, that Children's Health Insurance Program is now going to be funded for at least an additional 6 years.
Yes, and it was just in the nick of time, because Virginia was going to run out of money for the CHIP program, I think, January 31st. So we had already notified the families that they might lose their coverage, and so now it'll be good to give them the good news that they'll have it for another 6 years.
A lot of changes in the House of Delegates. In your wildest dreams, did you think the Democrats would pick up 15 seats?
Honestly, no. I thought at best 10, and that was, a dream. So I was very excited on election night.
Now, what about those anomalies that occurred? We had one in the Virginia Beach area. We had one in the Fredericksburg-Stafford area. The Virginia Beach area was settled by picking out a name out of a bowl.
Yeah.
Stafford, Fredericksburg, because there was no court intervention available, that went to a Republican. I think there was an 86-vote margin in a case where there was a lot of confusion about whether people voted in the correct precinct.
Right. There were about 100 people who were given the wrong ballot, and it was an 86% or vote margin. So that definitely could have made a difference. And There are some bills that have been introduced to try to address what happens in the case of a tie now, or what happens if, trying to limit or reduce split precincts when we do redistricting. But I think that both of those races are sort of a field coordinator's worst nightmare. If I had only gotten just one more vote out, could have made a difference. So, yeah, that was a heartbreaker.
Of course, you mentioned redistricting. Before you know it, it will be 2020 again.
Yep.
And I know you've been supportive of and an advocate for some type of nonpartisan redistricting commission. Talk to us about the potential for that yet.
I think that's still a possibility. That didn't break down on party lines as much as you would expect, but I think a lot of the people that didn't return on the House side were some of the impediments to that. And so I am hopeful we will have some form of independent redistricting commission. I think one of the problems that we have is redistricting happens so fast. Mm-hmm. Virginia is one of the first states to get the census data. We do our redistricting in April, and it's I think at a minimum we need to take a little bit more time, which I know is hard to do because it's an election year, but I think it's better to take the time and make sure you've done it right than to rush through.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's any more pre-clearance requirement from the Department of Justice anymore?
That is correct. With the court struck down the
Voting Rights Act,
the Section 5, which was the
right.
pre-clearance requirement, and so I'm hopeful that that Congress will put it back in place, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
And there are a number of voting rights cases pending before the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with voter purges, for example, voter ID, and a brand new question about how much politics can be involved in redistricting.
Yes, then there's also there's a pending redistricting case here in Virginia that challenged the 12 majority-minority districts in the House. I actually was a witness in both trials for that, and so we're waiting on the remand. Depending on what happens with that, we could have to draw the lines again and have another House election in 2018.
How does it feel having more female colleagues on the House of Delegates side at least?
It's pretty great, and in particular, I was the first House member to be pregnant while in office. Both of my children were born after I got elected, so I spent 2 sessions pregnant. I spent 2 sessions with nursing babies. And now we have 2 members who have infants. Kathy Tran has an 11-month-old, and Jennifer Carol Foy, who has 5-month-old twins. And it was pretty lonely when you're sort of the first one, and you're like, I got to figure out where am I going to pump, or I'm going to nurse my child if I need to? What am I going to do about daycare if we're here after daycare closes? Now, though, there's a lactation room in the Pocahontas building. They're changing tables in the men's bathroom, which my husband really would have appreciated. And we're talking through with the governor's office, providing some kind of daycare. So it's really refreshing to see that it's not so unusual anymore.
There was a press conference, I think, yesterday that a number of the women delegates held, highlighting some issues that are near and dear to their hearts. I know there was a Women's Dignity Act that I think Jennifer Boysko has introduced.
I think it's the whole Women's Health Act, and I have the Senate version, if it's the one I'm thinking of. And basically what it would do is codify Roe versus Wade in the Virginia Code and repeal some of the more restrictive laws that we passed since 2012, including the ultrasound requirement before a woman can have an abortion, and basically remove the artificial barriers that the General Assembly put in place for a woman's access to abortion or reproductive health care under the McDonald administration.
I think there's another one dealing with feminine products.
Oh,
for
yes,
example.
yes, that one. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that one would. It basically removes the tax on feminine hygiene products and treats them as other medical necessities, because other medical necessities you don't have to pay the tax on, and tampons and sanitary napkins aren't a luxury, and so I think I'm a co-sponsor of that. If not, I'll make sure I am.
Great. So I take it your committee assignments have remained the same on the Senate side?
Yes, no changes on the Senate
So
side.
you're on agriculture, local government, and transportation,
That's
I
right.
believe. Let's turn to a little bit more discussion about some of the legislation that you are pursuing. The King Commission, for example. Tell us why that's important, especially this year.
Sure. So I'm chair of Virginia's Martin Luther King Commission, and this year we will commemorate the 50th anniversary of his assassination on April 4th. What we decided to do was something a little bit different. We had a project we started a couple years ago called King in Virginia, where we started collecting information on King's visits and ties to Virginia. He visited 12 localities between, I think his first visit was either 1954 or 1956. And his last one was in 1967. He actually was scheduled to come do a tour through the Hampton Roads area as part of the People to People campaign. He was going to come March 30th of 1968, and he canceled it to go to Memphis instead to support the sanitation workers. And so we're going to do a series of community conversations in each of the localities where he visited, where we talk about the historic context of his visit so that everybody in that community is even aware today, King was here. We'll talk about where are we in this community in achieving King's vision of a beloved community, which is essentially, there'll be no racism, there'll be no sexism, because people will have moved beyond that. And where do we go from here? And that was a theme that he really focused on the last year of his life. He wrote a book, he gave a speech, sort of focused on, now that we have gotten the Voting Rights Act, now that we've gotten the Civil Rights Act, where do we go from here? And so the first one is actually going to kick off on March 1st at Virginia Union, which was his very first trip to Virginia, was to Virginia Union for a conference. And we'll, again, there are about 12 localities where he visited, and so we're going to do this in every single one, so that we can focus on his legacy and how do we achieve his dream and not just spend one day mourning his death.
Now, if I wanted to get more information about the King Commission and those dates and the sites, where would I go? So
we have a website. It is mlk.dls.virginia.gov. We also have a Facebook page that I think is VA MLK Commission. Or if you just, contact me at my phone number or email or the usual places, I can make sure you get that information.
Great. One of the issues that caused quite a stir and controversy the last year here in Virginia and in the South in general relates to Civil War monuments. And I know there are a number of bills that have been introduced dealing with whether those monuments should or should not be removed, who would have the authority to make that decision. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so currently there's a state law that says that a locality, it authorizes a locality to build war memorials, including the Civil War, but says that once built, they cannot be moved, changed, altered, taken down, period. And there is some uncertainty as to whether that applies to all localities or not. It clearly applies to counties. There's some ambiguity whether it applies to cities. But I think there are a couple of bills that make clear that decision is the locality. So if they can, they authorized it, they can decide whether to move or alter it. And I think that's the right way to go, because these are very difficult conversations, but ultimately it's the community where that monument is that is the most affected by it, and they should be the ones to make the decision. And you need to make sure they're heard. We had a bill last year that would have made clear no locality could take these down. It was vetoed, but the Governor McClellan, put together a task force that sort of looked at how should these questions be answered. And everybody on the task force agreed you have to have community conversations, sort of in the roundtable format, that ensure that all points of view can be heard, and they need to be heard. And so, take the city of Richmond, for example. When the Monument Avenue Commission held its first meeting, hundreds of people showed up. And when we had the hearing on the bill just to decide whether the local government can have the authority to do this, 3 people showed up. So it is a lot easier for you to have your voice heard in the community where you are, in the community where these statues are. And these are conversations that we need to have.
And that's because in the city of Richmond, for example, the city council meets in the evenings.
Yes.
As opposed to the General Assembly, your committee hearing was, I believe, at 4 p.m.
Right. And I mean, what if it, if we're talking about a monument in Bedford or,
Right.
2, 3, 4 hours away, you're not going to be able to come down here to testify in the middle of the afternoon.
I take it there was a difficult moment for the new lieutenant governor yesterday in terms of recognizing some Civil War generals.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that.
So Senator Emmett Hanger had a point of personal privilege and moved to adjourn in the honor of Stonewall Jackson. And the lieutenant governor handed the gavel over to the president pro tem because he just didn't feel comfortable presiding over that. And to his credit, Senator Hanger acknowledged in his remarks that when you look at some of these people today and you realize they were flawed, that you have to acknowledge that and you have to put them in context. So, I'm glad he did that. But for those of us who are descendants of slaves, who know that if the Confederacy had prevailed, we would not be where we are today. There are a lot of people who don't feel that the Confederacy is, or its leaders is something to celebrate. I think the lieutenant governor just felt, I'm not comfortable with this, and I'm gonna, in a very dignified way,
Right.
express sort of my disagreement with this.
Tell us why family life education is so important to you.
So it's one thing we've seen in the past year with the Me Too movement and all of the women and men who have come forward to acknowledge that they have either been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, is there is a pervasive culture of some people believing they can do whatever they want. Last year, I had a bill that added the concept of consent to family life education because we already teach how to prevent sexual assault, sexual violence, dating violence. We added that consent is necessary for sex, but it was permissive. And so this year I had a bill that makes that mandatory. There were also 2 other bills that were combined with mine to add instruction on how to avoid child abuse, child abduction, child exploitation, sexual exploitation, and to discuss sort of the dangers of sexting or posting sexually explicit materials online. Because what our children need to understand is, sex if you're under 18, or sending sexually explicit pictures through text or putting them online, that's a crime. They need to know that, because what they think is, boys will be boys or girls will be girls, can put them in jail. And they need to understand that. But we also need to teach that it's not okay for you to, do what you want to someone without their consent. And what really hit home to me in the middle of all of the what I'll call a reckoning right now, I was watching a James Bond marathon, and I was watching Octopussy, and there was a scene where James Bond borderline sexually assaulted someone, and it was a sort of if I just keep at it and keep at it, eventually she'll give in. And I looked at my husband and I said, you know what, there's a whole generation of men who grew up on these movies who think that's being cool. It's not cool. And I think that conversation needs to start happening the minute we start talking to our kids. I mean, age appropriate, of course.
Sure.
But the minute we start talking to our kids about sex or relationships, they need to understand you need to have someone's permission before you touch them.
Now, another issue that you've been pursuing over the past few years at a different part of the spectrum relates to how kids are treated K through 12 in terms of discipline.
Yes.
We've got this pipeline now.
Yes.
From the classroom to the courtroom.
Yep.
How are we addressing that?
So there are a number of bills, repeats from last year. One that would limit, and I'm not sponsoring, I'm a co-sponsor, but one would limit the use of expulsion or long-term suspension for kids who are third grade or younger. And there's another one that would limit the number of days that a student can be suspended long-term.
So there were kids actually in kindergarten who were being suspended?
Kids in pre-K who are being
Pre-K.
suspended. And when you look at what they're being suspended for, I mean, there was a kid in Lynchburg who, he's autistic, he got sent to the principal's office, and on his way he kicked a trash can. Not only was he, I think he was suspended long-term, he was referred to law enforcement for disorderly conduct. So those are a couple of bills that we have. I have some budget amendments to try to get at it because we recognize that the schools need resources to deal with some of the behavior problems. One of my budget amendments, it's pretty big and probably isn't going to pass, but it gets rid of the cap that we put on support personnel, guidance counselors, social workers, counselors, nurses. Because we did that during the recession as a matter of necessity, but the result is now our teachers are being forced to not just teach, but to be counselors, social workers, nurses in some cases. And a lot of the behavior that we are seeing, in some cases, it is the beginnings of autism or someone who's on the spectrum or someone who has a disability, but it manifests itself through behavior. Teachers aren't equipped to identify or deal with that. And so I put in a budget amendment to get rid of that cap. It is, admittedly hundreds of millions of dollars, but I did that to show if you want to fully fund the needs of all of our schools, this is how much it's going to cost, and sooner or later we need to have that conversation.
So what was the purpose of these school resource officers that were?
So school resource officers were put in place, started with the war on drugs to sort of address drugs in the school, and that's also where we started taking the discretion away from principals about what to report to law enforcement or not. After Columbine, they also were focused on school safety. So I had a bill a few years ago. Their primary job is school safety and truancy. But it used to be if they were funded by the state, they also were required to enforce the school code of conduct. That's not their job. And I put in a bill a few years ago to get rid of that aspect. And we also have bills this year to give principals more flexibility on whether to report misdemeanors to law enforcement. Or, everybody agrees if someone commits a felony, they should be referred. But I think we have gone down the path of criminalizing childhood in the name of keeping our kids safe. What we've done is created a school to prison pipeline that once these kids interact with law enforcement for the first time, or once they're put out of school, they're starting down a path that's going to lead to prison.
And a lot of these kids are minority students.
Yes, I also put in the bill that several years ago that required the school divisions to report their discipline data by gender, race, and disability. Now that we have that data, and we have several years of that data, it is showing that students of color and students with disabilities are disproportionately expelled, suspended long-term, and referred to law enforcement. And Virginia is actually the #1 in the nation referring kids overall to law enforcement. So we are moving in the wrong direction, but everybody recognizes this is a problem we need to fix.
Gun violence, still with us, unfortunately.
Yes.
What are you doing in that regard?
So I had a bill that came out of the governor's review of what happened in Charlottesville that would have allowed localities to ban weapons at permitted events, because people were showing up fully armed. It is a miracle that more people weren't killed in Charlottesville based on what was seen on the ground. Here in Richmond, when we had the rally on Monument Avenue, where I live, by the way, I live right around the corner from the Lee statue. Because the Lee statue was state property, the state had the ability to ban weapons on the Lee Monument property. Well, across the street is city property, or Stonewall Jackson, or any of the other monuments. They're city property. The city didn't have that authority. So my bill would have just said, for a permitted event, you can ban weapons in the permit area, to sort of take away the possibility that some of these heated protests that we've seen, which evidence is that that's more of what these protests are going to be, that Charlottesville might not have been a fluke. You need to give law enforcement that tool to keep people safe. Unfortunately, that bill didn't get out of committee. I had another one for the city that would have required reporting of lost and stolen firearms within 24 hours. And unfortunately, that one didn't pass either.
Teacher surveys. I know you're dealing with a lot of teachers, their concerns. Tell us about what you're hearing.
So we have a huge teacher shortage, and we've spent some time over the past year focused on the teachers entering the profession to try to make that easier. But the other side of that coin is making sure teachers stay. And while salary is one factor why they leave, what I'm hearing on the ground is it's mostly working conditions, the lack of support, the stress of the job. And so I have a bill that would implement a anonymous teacher survey every 2 years, where all of our public school teachers could take a survey administered by the Board of Education to get at, are you satisfied? Do you feel like you've been prepared for your job? And if not, what do you need, so that we have data to address the retention side of the teacher shortage.
Great. Well, we wish you luck 2018, and hope to see you back here again, Senator Jennifer McClellan.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.